DaFAQ!
Big K, when should I change my strings? Thank you, Steve. The answer is as simple as the excellence of the question. For this question, I've heard a wide variety of answers. Some say replace strings as soon as 6 months. Others have said up to a year. Some say replace the strings as soon as they lose their fresh tone. They're all correct, but I believe they're taking too many liberties with the word should. Why? Well, when you're learning a new art, you reasonably want to make sure you're not doing anything wrong or, accidentally damaging your instrument. So you put a lot of importance in the advice you receive, and you don't know if the advice is practical or just a reflection of the giver's own personal tastes. It's just like if you were learning how to bake a cake and the person teaching you says, don't use cinnamon. Well, are they saying that because cinnamon will somehow make the cake go flat? Or are they saying it because they themselves don't like the taste of cinnamon? Often when people give advice, it's something like the latter. They discourage what they themselves personally don't like the flavor of. And I don't think that's very helpful for the journey of the newcomer. So when I give advice, I try my hardest to make sure it's very practical and at least there's some explanation behind it. More than just, don't do it because I don't like it. So when it comes to strings, when should you change strings? When they break. It's as simple as that. You're not going to damage the instrument by leaving strings on too long. 3 months, 3 years, it doesn't matter at all. If you're practicing at home and you're happy with the sound of the strings, then changing them is nothing you even have to consider. Now, there are 3 main reasons why strings could be changed, and one of these may or may not apply to you. Practical reasons first. Change strings if you have a performance coming up. You never know exactly when strings will break, although you can get an idea by examining the strings. Nylon strings can get notches, and silk strings can start to fray where you strike with the bachi or where they rest under the kolma. Now, they still can be used, it's just they're more likely to break sooner than later. And if you have a performance coming up and don't want to risk them breaking on stage, sure, definitely, replacing the strings is a good and practical thing to do. However, if you want to keep your performance spicier, keep the strings on. Next practical reason, change strings if you want to capture the freshest tone for a recording. The tone of new strings is very fresh. It sounds so alive and has an almost electric-like vibrance. Whenever I replace my strings, the first thing I think is, wow, my shamisen sounds so much like a shamisen now. It sounds funny to say, but it's very true, because fresh strings brings out what's considered an essential element in the shamisen paradigm, and that's shari, a shimmery, crispy tone. It's the reason why many professional players in Japan replace their natural skins every few months, because fresh strings and fresh skins brings out that shari tone. So replacing strings is worthwhile if you're doing a studio recording, because ideally you want to capture the tone at its most vibrant, assuming you like the sound of fresh strings. Now, the last reason is not exactly practical, but it is valid. Replace strings if you just like the sound of new strings. As I said before, new strings have a bright and shimmery tone, and just like with natural skins, that shimmery tone naturally degrades and goes towards a more flatter sound. Whether it's shamisen or other instruments, some folks can't stand the sound of old strings and will change them every few months just for their own personal satisfaction. That's perfectly valid. If that's what you need to do to enjoy your instrument, then go for it. Personally, I'm one who will wait for the string to break before changing it, unless I'm recording. It's not that I don't enjoy the sound of fresh strings. I love it. It's just, strings cost money, shipping costs even more, and after they're removed, I'm just going to throw them away? Am I really going to be happier doing this regularly just to maintain a standard for something that's, all in my head? Or am I going to be happier by enjoying the strings while they're fresh and then just accepting the natural change of the tone and be content with it? I'm able to do the latter, and I find myself, ease of heart, as it were. and I know what it's like to be the opposite. So when it comes to bread, I love the smell, the texture and taste of fresh homemade baguettes. And I don't know why, but when it gets a day old, I get so bothered by the change of the texture. I really wish I could be with bread the way I am with strings, if that makes sense. I don't know why I just can't move it over. And that kind of shows that it's not something I have any will or control over. That's why I'm not saying, you should be content with old strings. If you can be content, that's awesome. And I think you're going to be happier that way. But if you find yourself naturally bothered with the sound of flat strings, then, I can understand because I'm that way with bread. It's a curse, as it were. So, do what you have to do to be happy. My dad says, I'm just not hungry enough. It's not exactly the point. Anyway, in summary, you don't need to change the strings until they break. However, it might be a good idea to if you're preparing for a performance, if you're about to do some studio recording, or if you need new strings to be able to enjoy the sound of the shamisen. Just don't feel that you're required to change dull strings if you don't mind them sounding dull. Contentment is a much happier state of mind than constantly chasing an ideal tone that naturally degrades. You don't want to end up like me with day-old baguettes. Now I'm getting hungry. Kyle Abbott.